If you shoot corporate interviews long enough, there's one location you can almost guarantee you'll end up in: the conference room. With flat colored walls, large tables that you can't move, overhead lighting, and an overall uninspiring look, it's often the biggest visual challenge that we face as cinematographers. So the question becomes, how do we make interviews visually interesting when we're forced to use these less than ideal spaces over and over again? Well, in this video, I'm breaking down a recent setup where I challenged myself to rethink the space, experimenting with framing in a way I normally avoid, and using lighting and exposure to create depth and contrast, turning a boring conference room into something that actually feels cinematic. Now, if you've ever walked into a corporate interview location and felt limited by the space, this breakdown will give you practical tools you can apply immediately. No fancy locations, no massive crew, just intentional framing, lighting, and exposure choices that completely change the way the room feels. Let's dive right in. I recently had to shoot an interview in this classic, boring conference room, and I was genuinely happy with the results. The depth, the soft lighting, the composition, the backlight, it all worked. And honestly, that surprised me. I had shot in this particular room before, and my expectations were pretty low. If I could just make the interviews look decent, I would have been satisfied. That's usually the bar in these kind of spaces. But this time, I decided to try something different with my framing. I wanted to find a way to actually show the conference table. Well, typically when I arrive on location, the first thing that I look for is a corner. Shooting towards a corner is one of the simplest ways to add depth, especially compared to shooting into a flat wall. Just pointing the camera towards the corner immediately gives the frame more dimension. What's interesting is that despite doing that for years, I had never actually tried combining that approach with the conference table itself, letting it live in the frame and work as part of the composition. And that decision ended up changing everything about how this room felt on camera. Now, when we first arrived, I had a very hard time finding the framing that I wanted in this room. So I tried a little bit of everything, and I actually tried to shoot directly across the table, kind of like where that chair is. I put my tripod. This is a tripod and a camera. I don't know how to draw, but trust me, this is my tripod and my camera. And I pointed it with somebody sitting here. This is a person, 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. And they were looking straight into the camera across the table, and kind of framed the windows, looking out the window. And it didn't work for a lot of reasons. One is the view, again, out the window was not great, didn't look good. There was nothing there interesting. And then it created this separation, like the table became like a desk, and it became really business looking. Very cold with the person sitting on the other side of the desk, and it didn't feel like a conversation. It really created a barrier between the viewer and the person telling their story. Even though this is a corporate video and we're not talking about, emotional things, it still had this visual feel of a barrier between the viewer and the person talking. And so it just did not work. So it wasn't until I pointed the camera towards this particular corner that it actually worked. And you can see like the camera is almost on the same side as the person being interviewed. It's kind of like at the end of the table, but closer to his side. And so you don't have that visual barrier of the table in between the viewer and the presenter. And so it just created something that was a lot more comfortable. And I think for them, it was an anchoring spot too, of instead of just being sitting in a chair with lights and cameras pointing at them, they had this anchor where they could put their hands on the table, and it just felt natural for them and it felt comforting. And they were very relaxed and very natural on camera. So now that we found our framing, the next thing that we need to do is work on exposure. And if you've watched any of my videos on exposure or lighting before, you've probably heard me say this a few times. But I'm a strong believer that camera settings are not exposure tools. They're creative tools. They're there to create a certain look for your image, not to just limit the amount of light that comes into your camera. I shoot with an FX6 and the base ISO is 800, and there's no movement here. So I don't need to be creative with my shutter speed. I can leave it at just about anything and it will be okay. I turned all the lights off in the room, so there's no flickering of the overhead lights that we need to worry about. And typically that's how I use my shutter in the corporate world, is to eliminate flickering of monitors or flickering of light bulbs, like practicals. And in this case, we have none. So my shutter was set to 1/60th, and I'm going to leave it there. So really the only setting that I need to really play with is my aperture. And in this case, because we're trying to build depth, I want to shoot as shallow depth of field as possible. So I adjusted my aperture to a 1.6. That gave me a little bit of latitude and still gave me a very shallow depth of field. So now that we have our camera settings done, we can now look at exposure. And when I say done, I mean we're not going to touch our camera settings again. This is it. They're staying the way they are. And now the next step is to actually expose. And when we talk about exposure, you always expose for the uncontrollable. And the uncontrollable in this frame is that window. I have no control about the amount of light that's coming in through that glass. The sun is doing its thing. Now the beauty is, again, we had a good cloud coverage. I know the light is going to stay pretty even throughout the rest of the day. It's not going to fluctuate. There's enough cloud that it's just not going to break through. And so at that point, what I need to do is add some ND filter. And I'm going to look at my false color on my monitor and continue to add my variable ND filter until that window is in range of what I'm trying to do. And I want it to not clip, but be very close. And again, I'm not super worried about what's out there because you can see the sky is completely gray. And so I'm not going to make it not white. It's just going to be pure white anyway. All I want is that as a viewer, you can see that there are things out there. If there's colors, great, a little bit of color, so we can see a little bit of the building. We can see a little bit of trees, but I don't need that to be completely exposed for the sky because the sky is pure white anyway. And so I'm just going to look at my false color and get it to a point where I feel pretty comfortable. And you can see it on the false color, I'm almost at 100 IRE in the corner of that window. But the rest of the window is well within range of normal exposure. The natural light is doing magic for me. And that's creating this gradient here that we see from behind the subject. As it goes up the wall, it gets darker and darker and darker. And that's what we're looking for. What we want in order to create depth is to have a variety of brightness level in all over the picture. We just don't want the picture to be the same level everywhere. And so here you can see that we're brighter here. And as we're going further and further, it gets darker and darker, right? But it also adds a lot of bright spots and shadows in places that amplify depth. So for example, like those dark spots here created by those corners, those are awesome. It just creates that little texture. And we got lucky that not only was the weather cooperating with us, but we had a room that had this little corner, which is unusual. Sometimes, most of the time I would have just a flat wall there and I would not have this little element that again add to creating depth and texture to this wall. We did place this table here to break this beige wall. We found this little table in another office and we brought it in and just scooted in. And then the brightness, the reflection of the top of the table is a great thing again, because it adds another brightness spot to kind of break the flatness of everything else. And we can see it everywhere. Like there's brightness on the armrest of that chair or reflection on this table. And we got lucky with the picture as well, because if this picture was a bright white picture, it would have been very difficult, but we are lucky that it's a dark picture and with white trims. And so all of those played a role into creating something that was not flat and that had texture and a feel. We didn't have to add any light to the background. What you see here is really just the result of the natural light coming in. And now we could have forced that. Let's say the room was a lot darker. Then all we needed to do was to place a light on the floor behind him that would literally just mimic this gradient. We would just splash some light up on the wall at an angle so that it would go from brighter to darker, and we would recreate that same gradient. Now what we need to do is worry about the subject. And the main problem that we have, and this is why I didn't point my camera towards this corner initially, is by facing this way, he is now looking away from the window, and his key side is now his right side, meaning I cannot use all this daylight as a natural key light. And I actually have to block all of it to create any kind of contrast on his face. I was lucky again that if I show you the setup, we had blinds that were full blackout blinds that I could lower. And so we lowered every blind that affected him, where the light was coming and hitting him directly. And so it ended up being all of the window except that back one that actually is in the picture. Everything else we completely blacked out. And so that was, again, a great advantage to have those blinds. Not only is it blocking all the lights from coming to him, it's also impacting the levels in the room. So when we closed all those blinds, the levels in the room went down, make the room even darker. So we have to go back to the false color to make sure that the level on the back wall are still good. All we need now is to add our key light. You can see that I have the egg crate attached to the softbox. And that's because the egg crate, what it does is it limits the spill. And so instead of the light spreading all over the room, it's going to kind of block it and narrow it to make sure that what we don't want is we don't want any of this light to come and interfere with our back wall. We want that light to just stay on him and not go over and change the levels on our back wall. And so the egg crate is helpful. And then the placement of the light is very important because we need to find an angle where it's, to his side enough so that it doesn't hit the back wall, but front enough so that it hits his face and doesn't create huge shadows. Because if we come, too much to the side, then his nose is going to start creating shadows here. If we come too much to the front, then the light is going to bleed over too much and we're just not going to have good separation. We just want to find that right medium where it's brighter here and it slowly fades off into a gradient into the darker side without creating those shadows. So what you do is you turn on false color on your monitor and you move the light further and further to the side of the subject, and you want to see that there's no more light hitting the back wall. And at that point, you kind of have the right location as far as the spill. And now we can work on the intensity. You still look at your false color and you keep raising the intensity of the light until you reach the levels that you want. And in our case, you can see what I'm looking for is that 60, 70 IRE, just a little bit of 60 or 70 IRE on his face. And then we have a good fall off on his left side where there's a real contrast between his key side and his fill side. And if you're getting into a situation where now the fill side is too dark, then you can add a bounce on that side. That's probably what I would have done. Instead of adding a light, you can add a light source, but that becomes very strong. And something where you just want to add a little bit, where maybe it's getting a little too dark, you can just put a white bounce board off camera to bounce back some of that light into his left side and control the levels that way. But that's kind of it for him. Like, there's no other light fixture that we use as far as his face. The last thing that we want to do now is look at a backlight or an edge light. And again, we were happily surprised to see that, and it might be hard to see on YouTube in a small frame, but there's a really bright, contrasty line all down his suit jacket. And that comes straight from the window. And that's what we want. It's creating a great separation. We really want, especially here where we have shadows in the corner and a dark suit, we want this bright line right here to just create some separation between the dark suit and the dark wall. And that's that edge light. And this is coming straight from the window. We didn't do anything with it. It's just, again, the right amount of light coming in. And you can see it here all over his sleeve, and it actually falls off, right? As it wraps around his sleeve, it gets darker and darker. And so again, it's creating a very nice separation here on his arm and all around his shoulder. The only thing that we added on the backlight is a tube to act as a top light, as a backlight. I wanted to separate his hair as much as possible from the back wall, especially because again, we're in the darker side of the wall and he already has dark hair. And so we don't want, kind of like here, to start having dark hair, dark wall kind of blend together. Now there's still separation because the colors are different, but to add these levels right here and wrap his head into this brighter light helps creating that separation. Now, typically I like a warmer backlight, so you can see it's actually bringing the red color out of his hair a little bit, because I probably set it a little bit warmer. Just for your information, we shot this at a 4400 Kelvin. I believe that's what it was. Now, we have no other lights in. We could have, should have shot it at 5600, which is daylight temperature, but I wanted a warmer feel. And so we actually started at 5600, and then I dialed it down to what I felt was a nicer, warmer feel. And that's why you see it on his face, like his skin tone is a little warmer. And that's because we set our white balance to 4400. And so that backlight is probably even lower. My guess is that's a 4000 Kelvin color temperature for the backlight. As far as the intensity of the backlight, I typically don't use my false color because a backlight doesn't have an actual target of a specific number that you want to hit as far as intensity. And so I just use my eyeball. I look at the picture, kept raising the intensity until I felt like that was the right level. So that's the full breakdown. A boring conference room, a table that you cannot move, windows that you can't control. But by being intentional with framing, exposure, and lighting, that space stopped being a limitation and started working for us. Now, the big takeaway here, it's the idea that depth, contrast, and connections don't come from the location. They come from the choices that we make. And if you understand how to use composition to create depth, how to use exposure to control contrast, and how to shape light instead of flooding a room, you can walk into almost any conference room and still create something that feels considered and cinematic. And that's really the goal. Not perfection, not fancy location, just consistently making better images, even in the most uninspiring spaces. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I share real-world setup like this one all the time, based on actual client shoots and real production constraints. And if you want to go deeper into cinematography, check out my online course on camera settings. I break down how to use your camera as a creative tool, not just a technical one, so you can make confident decisions on set instead of guessing. Thanks for watching, and happy filming.